atop the battlements of Castle Curmudgeon, where everybody knows the quickest way to a man's heart is through a nice big platter of seal meat and whale blubber. Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. America, and all ships at sea. Welcome to the Last Radio. So good of you to join us tonight. And as you may already be aware, the matter of Greenland, specifically the territorial sovereignty of Greenland, more specifically the question of who shall be Greenland's colonial master, been a topic of much discussion and controversy in recent weeks, and much of that discussion and controversy, not surprisingly, has been overheated and hysterical to the point of being really quite funny. In fact, some hyperventilating Europeans and many hyperventilating Democrats have even taken to calling it the Greenland crisis. Is it actually a crisis? Not really. How do we know it's not a crisis? Because we're literate enough to understand history didn't begin 5 minutes ago. And we are circumspect enough to recognize that all events in the present day are a culmination of a long series of previous events that transpired in years and decades and centuries past. And so, in order to underscore and reinforce these concepts that we endeavor so often on this program to underscore and reinforce, and in service to the cause of public mental hygiene, tonight we present for your kind consideration Curmudgeon's Field Guide to the barren Arctic desert that those cheeky Vikings ironically named Greenland, including an appearance by our special guest star, the Monroe Doctrine. And without further ado, let's strap on our sealskin boots and saddle up our trusty polar bear and begin the expedition, shall we? Episode 1, 986 AD, the first Norse settlement. Greenland enters recorded history the way many places do, by accident, by exile, and with an aggressively dishonest marketing campaign. Eric the Red, banished from Iceland for killing people who were apparently insufficiently understanding about being killed, sailed west and found a vast frozen landmass that he promptly named Greenland. This was not irony, it was branding. Medieval branding, to be sure, but branding nonetheless. The Norse settlement of Greenland was not a colony in the modern sense, it was more of a gamble. A thin string of farmsteads clung to the southwestern coast, surviving on seal meat, walrus, ivory, and an almost heroic, some might say irrational, level of stubbornness. There was no state apparatus, no standing army, certainly no imperial bureaucracy. Governance, such as it was, consisted of assemblies, kinship ties, and the shared understanding that wind and snow and ice are the real sovereigns. And this is worth lingering on for just a moment because it reminds us that for most of human history, sovereignty was not about flags or treaties, it was more about presence. If you could live in a place, farm a few meager crops there, and manage not to die immediately, you could plausibly claim ownership of it. As such, Greenland was not owned so much as it was endured. The Norse didn't conquer Greenland, they survived it, at least until they didn't. Episode 2, 1262 AD. Greenland enters union with Norway. By the mid-13th century, the Greenland Norse did what frontier communities often do. They desperately appealed for help. Or, more precisely, they acknowledged the sovereignty of some distant king in some faraway land in exchange for the vague promise of protection, legitimacy, and trade. In 1262, Greenland formally entered into a union with the Kingdom of Norway, becoming, on paper at least, a constituent part of a medieval Scandinavian realm. This was less an act of imperial expansion than one of administrative housekeeping. Norway didn't suddenly garrison Greenland or make any meaningful investment in its development. The crown asserted sovereignty in the way that medieval states preferred, by writing it down and trusting that geography would take care of the rest. And geography in this case was a very persuasive mistress. The Norse settlements declined over the following centuries, battered by shifting climates, economic irrelevance, and competition from the Inuit, who were far better adapted to the environment, having lived in it since time immemorial. By the 15th century, the Norse were gone, not conquered, not overthrown, simply erased by entropy. What's remarkable is that Norway and later Denmark never relinquished their respective territorial claims. Greenland became a sovereign possession without subjects, a legal fiction floating over an empty ice sheet. It was conquest by paperwork, and it worked rather astoundingly well. Episode 3, 1721, Danish-Norwegian resettlement and colonization. Greenland re-enters the European consciousness in the 18th century, not because it suddenly mattered strategically, it very much didn't, but because Europe never entirely forgot how much it dislikes unfinished business. In 1721, the Danish-Norwegian crown sponsored a renewed settlement effort led by missionaries who believed, incorrectly but quite fervently, that the Norse colonists might just still be out there waiting to be Lutheranized. They weren't, as it turns out. What Denmark found instead were Inuit communities who had lived in Greenland continuously and successfully, while Europe displaced the world's largest island for several centuries. This posed a bit of a mild philosophical inconvenience which colonial powers traditionally resolve by simply ignoring it. The new Danish presence was an explicitly colonial one this time: trading monopolies, missionary oversight, and very tight administrative control. Greenland was no longer a lost medieval outpost. It was a managed possession, still marginal, still remote, but now firmly slotted into the European system of empires that assumed land could be owned even when it steadfastly resisted habitation. From this point forward, Greenland's status would be defined less by who lived there and more by who claimed it. The ice stayed the same. The paperwork improved quite a bit. And that distinction between presence and possession is going to matter a great deal once the United States of America enter our story. Episode 4, 1814, the Treaty of Kiel and the Accidental Permanence of Denmark. Greenland's modern political status begins, as so many enduring arrangements do, as a clerical afterthought following decades of armed conflict. In 1814, Denmark found itself on the losing side of the Napoleonic Wars and was forced under the Treaty of Kiel to surrender Norway to the King of Sweden. This was supposed to be a clean divorce. In the actual event, it was not. Denmark, in a moment of legalistic nimbleness that would make future international lawyers politely golf clap in appreciation, managed to retain Norway's former overseas possessions, Greenland, Iceland, and the Faroe Islands. The rationale was thin, but the ink on the signatures dried anyway, and all of the wax seals were properly affixed, which in international law is what actually matters. Thus, Greenland became Danish not because Denmark had conquered it or settled it anew or even particularly wanted it, but because nobody else objected strongly enough at the negotiating table. Sovereignty here was not asserted with cannons or with colonists, but with a carefully worded footnote. When Edward Bulwer Lytton famously posited that the pen is mightier than the sword, this is just the sort of thing he was talking about. And this moment is a crucial one because it fixes Greenland's status in the European order just 9 years before the United States would announce, loudly and with great self-confidence, that Europe was no longer welcome to rearrange the Western Hemisphere at its will. Timing, as it turns out, is everything. Episode 5, 1823, the Monroe Doctrine and America's Grand Declaration. In 1823, President James Monroe informed Europe politely, firmly, and with a confidence that was not entirely justified by the current state of American military power, that the Western Hemisphere was no longer open for colonial business. The Monroe Doctrine was not a treaty. It was not even enforceable. It was, at the time, more of an aspiration than a policy, but it was also a warning shot. The doctrine rested on a simple premise: European political control in the Americas is inherently destabilizing and is therefore unacceptable. New colonies were out. Old ones were more complicated. The United States, still young and rather deeply insecure, was nonetheless staking a moral and strategic claim to hemispheric guardianship. Notably, Greenland was not mentioned. This was not an oversight, rather, it was a feature. Greenland sat awkwardly at the edge of geography and definition. North American in location, European in administration, and Arctic enough that nobody wanted to think very deeply about it. Thus, Denmark's claim slipped through the doctrinal net, grandfathered in only by inertia. The Monroe Doctrine, like all great declarations, drew bold lines and left the margins as fuzzy as possible. Greenland lived inside those margins, quietly Danish, while America directed its gaze instead to the south and the west, at least for now. Episode 6, 1867, Alaska and the Limits of American Patience. If Greenland represents the European talent for hanging on to territory by paperwork alone, Alaska represents the American allergy to leaving European powers anywhere nearby. In 1867, the United States purchased Alaska from the Russian Empire for $7.2 million, an act that was widely mocked at the time and almost universally praised in hindsight. This was not about whaling rights or seal pelts or even gold, really. It was about proximity. The idea of a European imperial power squatting indefinitely on the North American continent offended American strategic sensibilities in a way that could not be tolerated, even if the offender was broke, distant, and slowly collapsing. Had certain voices prevailed, voices counseling restraint, thrift, and minding our own business, Russia might well have retained a colonial foothold in North America well into the modern era. Monroe Doctrine, in that case, would have remained a polite suggestion rather than a lived reality. Alaska established a precedent. European possessions in the New World were acceptable only so long as they were temporary. The United States might tolerate them, but it would not forget them. And somewhere across the Arctic waters, Greenland quietly took note. Episode 7, 1898, the Spanish-American War, or When America Learned It Had Muscles. By the end of the 19th century, the Monroe Doctrine had evolved from a diplomatic posture into something closer to a personality trait. The Spanish-American War in 1898 marks the moment when the United States stopped merely objecting to European imperialism in the Western Hemisphere and began physically dismantling it at gunpoint. Spain lost Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines in one efficient imperial liquidation sale. The message to Europe was unmistakable. Old empires were no longer protected by tradition or by age or by paperwork. If you had colonies in the American sphere, you had them on borrowed time. This mattered for Greenland not because Greenland was threatened, but because the rules of the game were changing. The United States was no longer a continental republic with regional interests. It was becoming a hemispheric superpower with strategic horizons. The doctrine was no longer about non-interference alone. It was about control of outcomes. And in that worldview, geography becomes destiny. The Arctic stops being a frozen wasteland and starts being a map of future transit routes, military positioning, and access corridors. Greenland's value begins to shift, not as land, not as a colony, but as a platform. Denmark still owned it, but like a buxom blonde in a bar on a Saturday night, America had started noticing it. Episode 8, 1914 to 18, World War I and the Strategic Awakening of the North. The First World War reconfigured strategic thinking everywhere, but it had a particular effect on how powers viewed geography. Oceans stopped being moats and started being highways. Distance stopped being protection and started being vulnerability. The Arctic world entered military consciousness not as a battlefield, but rather as infrastructure. Shipping lanes, communication routes, refueling points, and future air transit corridors became planning considerations. Greenland's location, once a liability, became its defining feature, a massive immobile aircraft carrier between North America and Europe, whether anyone admitted it yet or not. The United States emerges from World War I with industrial power, financial leverage, and global reach, but also with a new obsession: strategic depth. Security was no longer about borders, it was about buffer zones, access control, and forward positioning. Greenland, again, remained Danish on paper, but it had entered the American strategic imagination in a way that it never had before, not as a territory to govern, but as a terrain to control indirectly. The old European model of sovereignty, of flags, monarchs, charters, and so forth, was colliding with the new American model of logistics, access, and influence. Episode 9, 1941, World War II and the end of Greenland's innocence. World War II is the moment when Greenland stops being abstract and becomes operational. When the Germans occupied Denmark in 1940, Greenland's legal status became suddenly profoundly weird. It was Danish territory governed by a government that no longer meaningfully governed itself. And let's face it, if the mother country can be conquered in under 48 hours by a couple of thousand men with parachutes, then its viability as a colonial administrator of huge faraway possessions has come very much into doubt. The United States responded pragmatically, but not necessarily legally. In 1941, America moved to protect Greenland on Denmark's behalf, establishing military bases and asserting de facto control over the island's defense. No conquest, no annexation, no declaration, just strategic necessity wrapped in legal fiction. This is the Monroe Doctrine in its mature form, not slogans, not speeches, not proclamations, but quiet occupation without formal ownership. From this point forward, Greenland becomes a functional part of American hemispheric security architecture. It is no longer European in any meaningful strategic sense, irrespective of whose flag flies over its capital. Denmark retains sovereignty, America retains control of outcomes, and the Arctic becomes part of the American defensive perimeter, not by law, but by logistics. Episode 10, 1947 to 1960, the Cold War and the Arctic as a tripwire. The end of the Second World War didn't bring peace so much as it brought planning. Specifically, planning for a war that everyone hoped would never happen, but which everyone assumed eventually would. Enter the Cold War, and with it, a grim new strategic logic. If nuclear annihilation was coming, it would come like a much angrier version of Santa Claus, namely, from the direction of the North Pole. Intercontinental bombers and later ICBMs didn't travel east to west along familiar maps. They went north. The shortest path between the Soviet Union and the United States ran straight across the Arctic, and Greenland sat squarely in the middle, like a very cold doormat. In this era, Greenland ceased to be merely useful, it became essential. Early warning radar systems, weather stations, and listening posts proliferated. The island became part of a continental nervous system designed to detect the first hint of Soviet aggression, not to stop it necessarily, but to give leaders a few extra minutes to decide how the world should end. The Monroe Doctrine was now fully militarized. No European power could meaningfully operate in the Arctic without American consent, and no adversary could pass through it unnoticed, at least not in theory. Greenland wasn't American territory, but it was unmistakably American space. Episode 11, 1951 to 68, Thule Air Base and the Nuclear Age Gets Real. If Greenland was the tripwire, Thule Air Base was the pressure plate. Established under a 1951 defense agreement with Denmark, Thule became one of the most important military installations on Earth, a hub for radar, air defense, and nuclear deterrence at the very edge of human habitability. This was not subtle imperialism. This was the enormous runways, nuclear-capable bombers, and a permanent American presence 750 miles north of the Arctic Circle. The local Inuit population was relocated to make way for it because strategic necessity has never enjoyed the luxury of sentiment. Then came 1968 when a US B-52 bomber carrying nuclear weapons crashed near Thule, scattering radioactive debris across the ice. Denmark, which officially prohibited nuclear weapons on its territory, learned the hard way what shared defense actually means. Greenland's role was no longer theoretical, it was baked into nuclear reality. The island existed functionally to absorb risk on America's behalf, geographic insurance against catastrophe. Sovereignty remained Danish, control remained American. Consequences were shared unevenly. Episode 12, 1991. The Cold War ends and everybody forgets why Greenland matters. And then, miraculously, the Soviet Union collapses. The existential threat evaporates. Nuclear Armageddon is postponed indefinitely, and with it, strategic memory begins to fade. Bases are downsized, budgets are cut, Arctic infrastructure is maintained more out of habit than out of urgency. Greenland slips back into the background, filed away in a folder labeled Cold War Leftovers. This was not because Greenland became less important, but because America had briefly convinced itself that history was over. The Monroe Doctrine entered a kind of bureaucratic hibernation, if you will, not repealed, not rejected, just assumed to be unnecessary and surplus to requirements. Europe was friendly, Russia was reforming, China was opening up. Greenland became a place for climate studies, indigenous politics, and polite international cooperation. Strategy gave way to symposiums. Deterrence yielded to PowerPoint slides. And as always, the moment a power stops thinking strategically is the moment it starts being surprised. Which brings us, inevitably, to the present. Episode 13, 2007 to 14. Russia returns, China arrives, and the Arctic reopens. History, as it turns out, like the man in the Monty Python picture, wasn't quite dead yet. In 2007, the Russian Federation staged one of the most on-the-nose geopolitical stunts of the modern era by planting a titanium Russian flag on the seabed beneath the North Pole. This was not legally binding, of course, but it was very much on brand. The message was clear. The Arctic was back, and Russia intended to treat it the way Russia has always treated frontiers, as places to be claimed, fortified, and argued over loudly. About the same time, China began referring to itself with a straight face as a near-Arctic power. This is an interesting phrase, in the same way that calling oneself nearly pregnant is also interesting. China's interest was not subtle. Shipping lanes, undersea cables, rare earth minerals, and the long-term leverage that comes from being present before anybody thinks to stop you. Greenland once again found itself at the center of a map that people had stopped pretending didn't exist. The Monroe Doctrine, long thought to be dormant, began twitching in its sleep. Episode 14, 2015 to 2020. Changing climates, new shipping lanes, and the return of geographic reality. ice melts, geography reasserts itself. As Arctic ice receded, new shipping routes emerged. Routes that could cut weeks off of transit times between Asia, Europe, and North America. What had once been an impassable wasteland became an economic accelerant. At the same time, Greenland's mineral wealth, long thought to be inaccessible, suddenly mattered. Rare earth elements, uranium, oil, gas, and strategic metals turned theoretical interest into practical concern. Denmark, a country whose entire population could fit into a mid-sized American metro area, found itself nominally responsible for a landmass of enormous strategic value at the exact moment that great power competition returned. Greenland's own autonomy movement gained momentum, but autonomy cuts both ways. Independence requires protection, investment, and allies. And once again, the same unspoken assumption resurfaced that whatever Greenland technically was, it could not be allowed to fall under hostile influence. Climatic changes didn't create this problem. It merely removed the ice from the cover page. Episode 15, 2021 to the present day, the Greenland crisis, and why it isn't one. Which brings us to the so-called Greenland crisis. Pearl-clutching Europeans recoil at the suggestion that the United States might seek sovereignty, control, or exclusive strategic dominance over Greenland. In London and Paris and Brussels and elsewhere, this is framed as shocking, aggressive, even unprecedented behavior. In point of fact, it is none of those things. From the Monroe Doctrine forward, the American position has been simple. European powers do not get to project strategic power in the Western Hemisphere in ways that threaten U.S. security. Greenland is not an exception to this rule. It is merely a test case. The fact that Denmark's claim predates the Monroe Doctrine by 9 years does not negate it. It merely explains why the issue was deferred until conditions changed. And conditions have most assuredly changed. If Greenland matters, and it very much does, then someone will control it. The only real question is whether that someone is a distant European monarchy, a rising Eurasian bloc, or the continental power that already defends it in every practical and meaningful sense. This is not imperialism, it is geopolitics doing what it has always done. Greenland has never been isolated, it has only been quiet. From Norse settlers to Cold War bombers, from Danish colonial administrators to Arctic shipping consortiums, the island has always existed at the intersection of ambition and necessity. The Monroe Doctrine did not create this reality, it merely gave it a name. And now, as ice melts and history resumes, Greenland returns to its accustomed role, not as a peaceful periphery, but as a strategic fulcrum. Anyone who is shocked by this hasn't been paying attention. Anyone surprised by America's interest has forgotten its own history. And anyone calling this a crisis is mistaking inevitability for controversy. And with that, we put the bear in the barn, retire to our cozy igloo, stick our boots by the fire, and I convey you into the custody of my distinguished colleague, your illustrious co-host, the one and only, your friend and mine, Mr. Caucasian Sasquatch.